I would encourage something we call adaptation, not adoption. We have three things. We have the clinical guidelines development, and this is a lengthy process. Unfortunately, in our region, we don't have enough data to develop, for example, guidelines from scratch. We hope we can do so at least either at the local or regional level in the future. Then we have adoption, that you just take the guideline and you follow it blindly or strictly. And we have what we call adaptation. And this what we have been trying to do in different places in the region, either in vaccines or oncology or other lines. And we'll discuss that in a minute. So it's really lengthy, huge process to move from the guidelines, from the evidence, from clinical trials, evidence from real world data, and then to look at the economic evaluation for different interventions to come with the guidelines. So usually the task force, a single guidelines around 30 or 40 experts. So it's a really difficult process. What we can do at this stage in our region, I would encourage is something what we call adaptation. Adaptation is, in summary, is that you have already guideline. Actually, one of the things I was trained on was to review different guidelines. We reached a consensus that the best approach is to utilize local data. We don't have that local data in the region, so I would encourage that to invest in the available experts to review. First of all, to have a committee decide which guidelines to look at in the region, then to modify these guidelines accordingly. So what we do, for example, in the guidelines and the how we adapt the guidelines. The guidelines that you have experts in that specific field, for example, pediatrics, type 1 diabetes, and you review the evidence, you review these guidelines. Sometimes we have the level of evidence in these guidelines, they are not level 1. Sometimes we have the evidence for indication, certain indication, these international guidelines, they are not coming from randomized controlled clinical trial, maybe from case series or from some observational studies. In this case, maybe you cannot afford this expensive medication without solid evidence, then you can play a role here in the guidelines adaptation. And this is the key for that. So for the adaptive process, initially we have to have certain questions. I'm going to study the type 1 diabetes pediatrics treatment guidelines in Jordan. Then to search and screen guidelines, we have 3 or 4 international guidelines. And then to assess these guidelines and to assess whether these guidelines, all of them are based on the current evidence. They are considered, for example, the economic evaluation studies. They are coming from the proportion of it coming from phase randomized controlled clinical trial or systematic reviews or meta-analysis. Then to draft, decide and select and draft guideline report. And then we have the review. And I can tell you guys, we have been involved in the mean NCCN guidelines since 2017 for, I'm in the committee for colon cancer, but we have other colleagues for other sites. Initially, we were like just new to this adaptation, but last year and this year, we managed to make major changes. Actually, they were even corrected within the global NCCN guidelines. We need to consider our resources. And this is why sometimes I have differences with our colleague Nimr about the US, for example, system is based on health insurance companies. In Saudi Arabia, they have plenty of resources. When it comes to Jordan, we cannot just follow these guidelines blindly. And this is why we need to consider all the available evidence there and to assess, especially if you have very expensive medication and there is no evidence from phase 3 clinical trial or from systematic review meta-analysis, I think we can maybe drop it or assess the economic impact of this medication before we include it on our final guideline. The reason why we need guidelines, adaptation or clinical guidelines, is that we need to have a major difference in the healthcare system in Jordan, in the region, compared with Western countries, is that we don't work in a systematic way. Any physician treating type 1 diabetes in Jordan at primary care, secondary care, they should follow these guidelines. And then we can assess these guidelines from through clinical indicators, the proportion of visits for emergency, percentage of admissions, complication rate, control of disease, and we decide whether we'll continue these guidelines or modify them accordingly. This is the key thing. Unfortunately, most of us, everyone treats by his own, her own. We have sometimes guidelines that are on shelf. I actually asked Dr. Nashat Aini to be with us specifically in this meeting because he's one of the, he's keen on having guidelines national. And the key thing is not just development of the guidelines, it's the implementation. We need to ensure also there is access to the medications, these guidelines, and then how we can follow them and monitor these guidelines. We need to start from somewhere. It's not too late for any positive change, but we need to work together to ensure that these guidelines are implemented. One of the key things in our healthcare system that, for example, now we have Hakim, for example, we can utilize it for these guidelines. We have the problem, the quality. We moved from clinical quality to more general quality. I think it's essential to have certain indicators to follow these guidelines and to edit these guidelines for local settings as well. We don't need to have them copy and paste because there's different international guidelines. The tricky thing is that which guidelines to select for your country and how to make changes to do your homework. And this is the MENA NCCN guideline. We have been working on this for the last 3 years, and I'm still learning and learning from my colleagues and from this experience of how we can modify international guidelines according to our regional settings and our resources. So just quickly, these are the steps, but it should be different stakeholders should be together. If you have, for example, type 1 diabetes management, as we mentioned earlier, we need to have some 2 or 3 experts in type 1 diabetes. We need to have someone from health economics background. We need someone from, for example, for the Minister of Health, someone from the GPD, someone from the central pharmacy. We need to have a good group of colleagues, someone from the FDA, I see Jaberhan. We need to have different stakeholders sitting together and decide the best one for one. I don't encourage to have blindly the international guidelines and to follow them. We need to consider the resources and the available evidence. And guys, I can tell you that we can modify most of these international guidelines according to available evidence. We can review this one, but I hope in the future we can have local data at the regional level so we can also have our own guidelines. But the key step now is to follow also after we have access to this medication, we started them to assess the impact of these medications. For example, in oncology, we hear with colleagues from Bahrain until Morocco that in their practice, they see major differences in clinical response or the incidence of ADRs. So therefore, maybe we can invest in modifying these guidelines, maybe the dose, maybe the medication, but we need to be vigilant and also to consider not just follow blindly these guidelines and then just leave them as they are. So we need to consider, just to conclude on this point, because sake of time, it's lengthy topic actually. Usually we cover this 10 minutes presentation over one day, as patient population, disease characteristics, interventions, professionals targeted by the guideline, the outcomes, endpoints to be taken into consideration, and healthcare setting, context, and available resources. There are many things we cannot afford. The level of evidence is not that strong, so maybe we can put them as second option, or the patient if they want to buy them, but we cannot afford to have all these medication, these guidelines. I'll skip at this point. There is different processes for the guidelines development and adaptation, but I do encourage to avoid the guidelines adoption. We need to have adaptation rather than adoption, and hopefully, inshallah, with time, we'll have something like the guidelines development. I will close at this point. I'll just show you a few slides for the next presentation, and then I'll leave it for the chairman. So, yes. Okay, I guess yes. Okay. Okay. When we consider, my colleague member will discuss this in more details. I have this 5 minutes just to discuss this briefly. When we have evidence, we need to look at the data we have in the country. For example, you are talking about vaccine. For me, I will not ask for any vaccine, especially new vaccines, to be entered in the pipeline in Jordan within the committee with my colleagues without having data on the incidence and the cost effectiveness. And this is the key thing for the data collection, is to have controlled and controlled assignments. And then we can get that from clinical trial if it's a controlled assignment, or we can get that from cross-sectional studies from real world data discussed through registries, or case control or cohort studies. There's something we call case series. Just case series that you present the clinical characteristics of a group of patients. There is a special form of case series, we call it disease registry. And this is also something that we lack in the region. If we have proper disease registries, at least for some common diseases, we can follow the patient and have real world data so we know the clinical outcomes, pharmacokinetics or pharmacovigilance data, then we can make decisions in our healthcare setting based on the local data. So we need to encourage these studies to be conducted, and also we need to consider at least to have registries if we are not doing clinical trials, or if the clinical trial evidence is there and we are not taking part of it, at least we need to focus on this registry and real world data to collect data on the clinical outcomes and pharmacovigilance. Encourage colleagues working biosimilars to do that as well in the region for the switching, interchangeability, and for the outcomes and pharmacovigilance. And when we consider guidelines, we have to look at the level of evidence. The highest is coming from meta-analysis, systematic reviews, then from clinical trials. And you can see the very common practice in the MENA region is expert opinion. This is the lowest in the evidence. I have sat in some committees in the region. We were discussing, for example, development of economic evaluation model. And some colleagues were asked about the quality of life of their patient. They don't know what's quality of life, what are components, what the impact. So I think we need to start from somewhere. If we start somewhere at expert opinion in the region, we should not follow this for the next 2, 3, 5 years. I believe that we should invest more in the disease registry, and also to get our region involved in clinical trials, and at least, or the minimum we can do is having cross-sectional studies to see the impact of different interventions, and we have valid data from the region. And the real world data is that what we get from databases of registries, and it will be of high value, especially in the region. We are not heavily involved in global clinical trials. Our contribution in the MENA region is less than 0.5% from the global clinical trials, although we consume around 10% of the global medications. So I think until we are part of the global clinical trials, we need at least to have databases or at least cross-sectional studies to assess the impact of different interventions from the clinical point of view and also from the pharmacovigilance point of view. Just a quick scenario, I think Nimr will give us more. If you have 2 interventions and you look at the clinical outcomes from them, this example is that you have to have surgical intervention or watchful waiting. For example, someone have gallbladder stone, you want to have it cholecystectomy or to have just follow-up. If you want to follow these 2 groups, if you don't have good data on the number of visits for the emergency, number of admissions throughout the year, if you have just, for example, if you at 1 year you ask these patients, you have 2 groups, one who underwent cholecystectomy, the other group were just watchful observation for 1 year. At the end of the year, if you ask patient about the number, for example, of visits to the emergency, number of visits to the doctors, admissions, they might not recall all these events. So if you calculate the economic impact, you find maybe that the cost of the operation is much higher than the, it will be more cost effective, for example. You'll find that if you don't have proper valid data, you'll decide that cholecystectomy is more expensive. But if you have valid data collection, proper follow-up, and solid data there about the number of visits, the number of medication used, hospitalization, visits to the outpatient, you'll find maybe later that the cholecystectomy is cheaper than the watchful observation. You can see if you look at the operation, you'll find the intervention cholecystectomy is the cost, for example, $10,000. In the US, it will cost $10,000. Watchful observation, if you ask just a patient about it, you might think it's only 500 USD. While if you have a proper valid data collection, you find by the end that if you had cholecystectomy for these patients, you are going to save resources from the admissions hospitalization. We are just entering the era in the region of having more evidence-based medicine. We need to be confident in the data that we collect, and we don't have enough time to go through the clinical research, but I can tell you that if you count only on the recall of the patients at 1 year, what happened throughout the year, you are going to miss major important data that will affect the outcomes of the health economic evaluation model. We need to ensure that we have follow-up proper data. If you have a hospital that has good hospital records, registered well at حكيم or بالسعودية عندهم register ببعض المستشفيات, you can do that in a retrospective way. But if you have major missing data, I encourage you to do a prospective study. It will be helpful more. For the sake of time, I'll stop here. The same what I mentioned about cholecystectomy or watchful observation, just follow up. We can apply it for drug A and B if you want to compare two medications together at the end of the year. If you don't have valid data, you judge maybe drug A is more cost effective. But if you have more valid data, you'll find that, and you are recalling all the outcomes, direct, indirect cost, you'll find that drug B will be more cost effective. The key message from this one, I know this really linked topic, is that ensure the data that you are adding to the model are valid. Otherwise, you'll make the wrong decision. Thank you very much.